Hi everyone, welcome to lecture number 33, the third lecture on labor market discrimination. In our last lecture, we discussed about the economics of discrimination and we discussed about discrimination coefficient. Based on that, how it may lead to sometimes employers discrimination, it may lead to employees discrimination, it may lead to sometimes the customers discrimination. In this lecture, we will discuss about discrimination and profits of a firm. We will discuss about the impact of discrimination on labor market outcomes. Further, we will discuss about different methods to measure the wage discrimination in the labor market. If you remember, we discussed this graph that how there are two types of firms in the market, those who discriminates between the black and white workers. So, some are white firms and some are black firms. So, white firm who discriminates on the basis of wage rate, who discriminates the workers, completely white dominated firm, they are going to hire E star W amount of workers at the wage rate WW, where this WW is greater than this WB, and the decision to hire is completely guided by the value of marginal product of labor. So, the white firms, they are not only hiring the workers at a higher wage rate, but also they are hiring less amount of workers. Had it been a situation a competitive firm, then the competitive firm would have been hired this W E star B amount of workers and at the wage rate WB. But it is a white firm, so it is going to hire all the white workers. So, the firm is going to have a higher cost because wage rate for the white workers is much higher than the wage rate of the black workers, and as well as it is going to employ less amount of white workers. So, the discrimination leads to a kind of inefficient allocation and inefficiency in the market, as well as it is going to have certain amount of impact on its profit, that we will discuss. Now, if the firm is some kind of discrimination is there, let us say the discrimination coefficient is D0, then the firm is going to hire E0B amount of workers at the wage rate WB 1 plus D0. If the discriminating coefficient is D1, the firm is going to hire E1B amount of workers at the wage rate WB 1 plus D1. So, as the discrimination coefficient goes on increasing, the firm is going to hire less and less black workers. So, we are assuming that the white wage exceeds the black wage, and the white firm is paying an excessive high price for its workers and hires relatively few workers. So, employers who dislike black workers sufficiently, therefore, not only hire all white workforce, but also hire relatively few white workers because white labor is expensive. Similarly, for the black firm, had it been a colorblind firm, then it would have been hire E star B amount of workers at the going wage rate W star B, but the firm is having some kind of discrimination. So, the discriminating coefficient is D0, the firm is hiring E0B amount workers at the wage rate WB 1 plus D0. So, this discrimination coefficient is small enough that the firm still wants to hire all black workforce. So, as you increase the discrimination coefficient, a firm with a larger discrimination coefficient hires even few black workers. So on and so forth, it will go on if we are going to increase the discrimination coefficient. So, the number of black workers hired therefore is smaller for the firm, that have a large discrimination coefficient, because employers do not like hiring black workers. They minimize their discomfort by hiring only a few black workers. That we have, those things we have already discussed in our previous lecture also. So, why I have discussed all those things here is that now we would like to take from this point to the profit, how this discrimination is going to affect the profit of the farm. So, what we have seen is that the taste discrimination affects employers' hiring decision, because the prejudice blinds the employer to the true monetary value which is associated with the hiring a particular worker. So, the farm is always going with a perceived value. The farm is not going to consider the true monetary cost, they are always going with a perceived cost. So, an employer who discriminates will act as if the cost of hiring a black or the female worker exceeds the actual cost. Now, from this discussion, we can draw some fundamental implications of Baker's theory, that the discrimination does not pay, actually it costs. Now, when we say discrimination does not pay, how we can measure this? So, consider first the profitability of the white farm. Now, if you look at the hiring decision, the farms are hiring E star W workers. So, the hiring decision, it seems to be unprofitable because of two reasons. First, this prejudiced employer could have hired the same number of black workers at a lower wage rate. They could have hired same amount of black workers, but at a lower wage rate, because the wage rate of black workers is less than the wage rate of white workers. And both the black and white workers, they are perfectly substitute. So, they could have produced the same amount of output at a lower cost. That is one way looking at that, how discrimination is unprofitable. The second and the additional way is that the white farms are hiring the wrong number of workers. Now, had it been a colorblind farm, they would have hired many workers, like E star B amount of workers. But by not hiring the right number of workers, the white farm further reduces their profit. So, they could have hired more workers, they could have produced more output. So, this argument also implies even black farms that discriminates, they are also giving up profits, because discriminatory black farm are hiring few workers, like E0B amount of workers or E1B amount of workers. They too also give up some profits in order to minimize the contact with the black workers. It depends on the degree of the discriminatory coefficient. So, we can see when it is a white farm, they are hiring E star W amount of workers and at the wage rate WW. In a competitive farm, non-discriminatory farm, they would have hired E star B amount of workers with the wage rate WB. So, a non-discriminatory farm, it maximizes its profit. So, on this part of this graph, we have taken the profit on the y axis, and on the x axis we have taken the discriminatory coefficient D, the degree of discrimination. Now, if the degree of discrimination, this D is 0, let us say this discrimination is 0, means the farm is a color blind farm. So, for him the profit is maximum. The farm is employing E star B amount of workers at the wage rate WB. Now, as the discrimination coefficient increases, this profit is going to decline. Now, as the discrimination coefficient increases from, let us say, D0, let us say at this wage rate, at this discrimination coefficient D0, the farm is hiring less amount of workers at certain cost, at certain price. So, the profit is going to decline. At D1, the further the profit is going to decline. So, after a certain threshold point, the farms becomes completely a white farm. So, up to this point, the farm is employing some black workers. So, it is a black farm, trying to minimize the contact, but still employs some amount of black workers. But after a threshold level of discrimination, the farm becomes a completely white workers. All the workforce in the farm, they are white. So, in the way Baker explains that this discrimination does not be a positive result. So, it has certain costs, and it costs in terms of reducing the profit. So, from the graph we can draw the relationship between the farm's profit and the discrimination coefficient. The most profitable farm is the farm that has a 0 discrimination coefficient. So, the colorblind farm hires all black workforce and containing the number of employment is E star B amount of workers, and it has the profit maximum. Farms with slightly positive discrimination coefficient still have all black workforce, but they employ few black workers and earn lower profit. So, at some threshold, as I said, at some threshold level of this discrimination prejudice, which is given by the discrimination coefficient D, the utility loss of hiring black workers is too large and the farm hires only white workers. As a result, the profit falls dramatically. Now, because the farm is paying a much higher wage rate, what it has to paid, because the farm is a discriminatory one and the discrimination is at a quite high level. So, because all white farms hire the same number of white workers regardless of their discrimination coefficient, so all white farms earns the same profit. So, while discussing Baker's model of employer states discrimination, it predicts that discrimination is unprofitable. Farms that discriminate is going to lose on two fronts. First is that they are hiring the wrong color combination, wrong color of the workers, and or they are hiring the wrong number of workers. So, both these hiring decisions move the farm away from the profit maximizing level of employment, which it would have been E star B amount of workers. So, the implication of this conclusion from this Baker's discussion on discrimination, it is far reaching. If the source of racial biasness in a competitive market is the employer, then competition is a minority group's best friend. Let me explain it once again. So, the implication is that if the source of racial prejudice or bias in competitive market is the employer, then competition is a minority group's best friend. Now, let us try to understand it. Now, what happens when there is a discrimination and it is a competitive market? because competitive market is having the characteristics of free entry and free exit of the farms, and this ensures that the farms in the market are not earning a supernormal profit, excess profit. So, employers must pay for the right to discriminate out of their own pocket. So, a color blind farm therefore should eventually be able to buy all the other farms in the industry. Now, as a result, the employer discrimination will wither away, wash away in the competitive market, because they have to pay from their pocket. If they are going to have some kind of discrimination, then they have to pay from their pocket. So, in a competitive and color blind farm who is not going to discriminate, then these farms will eventually be able to buy out all other farms in the industry, because the discriminatory farms in the industry, they are going to have loss. So, this competition will reduce or it will wash away the discrimination in the market. That is why Baker is more towards creating some kind of competitive environment in order to reduce discrimination. So, the comparison of this utility adjusted price with the actual price of the labor, which we have summarized in our equation, that WB into 1 plus D is less than or greater than WW. It tells that if a particular farm becomes a black farm or a white farm. So, farms with small discrimination coefficient will tend to become black farms, and the farms with large discrimination coefficient will tend to become white farms. So, we can use this insight to derive the demand curve of the black workers in the labor market. So, let us say initially suppose all the employers, they discriminate against black. So, every farm is having a positive discrimination coefficient. So, we are assuming that all the farms, those who are there in the market, they all discriminate. So, D is having some positive number. Now, when the black wage rate exceeds the white wage rate, so that the black white wage ratio is above 1, which means no employer, not even the employer who minds these blacks, at least wants to hire the black worker, because the black wage rate is higher than the white wage rate and the wage ratio is greater than 1. After all, what happens when the actual price of the black is above the price of the whites? Then the utility adjusted price of the black will be even more higher, and there is no demand for black workers. So, in fact, even if the black wages are slightly less than the white wages, this utility adjusted black wage will probably exceed the white wage for all the farms, and no employer will want to hire any black workers. Let us explain how it works while deriving the demand for black workers. If you look at this graph, on the x axis we have taken the number of black workers employed, and the y axis we have taken black and white wage ratio. And if it is greater than 1, the black and white wage ratio, the threshold level we have taken 1. If it is greater than 1, above this, then the number of black employment is 0. If the discriminatory coefficient is smaller, let us say the WB is less than WW, very small magnitude. Even if at that level, the black employment is going to be 0, because the utility adjusted price is going to be WB into 1 plus D is greater than WW. So, the number of black employment is 0. Now, consider what happens as the relative black wage decreases further. Let us say at some point the farm with the least prejudice, it crosses a threshold level, and this farm becomes a black farm, because blacks are relatively cheaper than the whites, and even after adjusting the disutility, the black causes the wage rate is less. So, as the black wages keep on falling, more farms are deciding to become black farms, because the black wage rate is compensate them for their prejudice. Moreover, those farms that were already hiring black take advantage of this lowering black wages by hiring more black workers. So, as the relative wage of the blacks falls further and further, the quantity demanded for the black workers will keep on increasing. Now, if the black wage is very low relative to the white wage, even farms with a very large discrimination coefficient have been brought off and will hire the blacks. So, the market demand curve of the black workers will be downward sloping. So, what we are discussing here is that there will be no demand for the black workers if the WB is greater than WW. If it is more than that, then the number of black employment will be 0. Now, even if this WB is less than WW, with this adjusted utility adjusted discriminatory farm, it is going to be more than this WW. So, the farm will not hire even if they are in that range. The threshold level, let us say it goes below, this WB goes below this point R. Now, the farm is becoming a black farm. The farm is going to hire more black workers. So, as the wage rate keep on declining, the farm is going to hire more and more black workers. So, therefore, you will find the demand for the black workers is downward sloping after certain threshold point. Now, if you look at the equilibrium point, of course, the equilibrium black white wage rate wage ratio depends not just on the demand for the black workers, but also on the supply of the black workers. So, let us assume that the supply of black workers is perfectly inelastic, means the number of black workers supplied at a particular point of time is fixed. So, you can estimate the equilibrium black white wage ratio. So, what we have seen is that the demand for black workers is downward sloping, and the supply of black workers at a particular point of time, it is perfectly inelastic. So, the equilibrium wage ratio is decided based on the interaction of this demand and supply, which is WB by WW star. This is the equilibrium wage rate. If the relative black wage is above the equilibrium level, then there are too many black workers, they are looking for work relative to the demand for black workers. Therefore, there is a downward pressure on the relative black wage. The opposite will happen if the relative black wage is below the equilibrium wage rate and there are too few black workers, those who are looking for the work, and the black wage would rise as the employer compete with these workers. So, we can derive several properties from this equilibrium point which we discussed in the graph. The most important point is that the intersection of this supply and demand curves occurs below the point where the black and white wage ratio is equals to 1. So, it implies that the employer discrimination generates a wage gap between equally skilled black and white workers. The employer cares about the working condition, particularly the color of the workforce. Now, because all employers dislike hiring blacks, a compensating differential arises to compensate employers for hiring these workers. So, in effect, we can say that the black workers must compensate employers so as to soften the employer's resistance to hire black workers. Further, it is important to note that the allocation of black workers to the farm, it does not happen randomly. Black workers are hired by the farms that choose to become black farm. So, employers who have the smallest discrimination coefficient, they run these black farms. The black workers therefore, they are matched with the employer who have the least prejudice, whereas the white workers they are matched with the employers who dislike the black workers. So, the distribution in the market does not happen randomly, it is just a kind of match made. Here we have assumed that all the farms discriminate against the blacks. So, some farms however might prefer to hire blacks. So, in that case this nepotism, the nepotistic farms get utility from hiring blacks. So, many of these farms would hire blacks even if the black wage were higher than the white wage. So, as a result the demand for the black labor will shift up. Now, you can see because some farms are already there in the market, those who are black farms, they find that the wage rate is black wage rate is going to be lower than the white wage rate, and even if the black wage rate is higher than the white wage rate, they demand more black workers. So, the demand for curve can shift from D to D dash, which may lead to a wage rate wage ratio WB by WW at a much higher level, because the number of black workers they are fixed. If there are relatively few blacks in the labor market, then the equilibrium black white wage ratio could be above 1. Even if most farms in the labor market dislikes hiring blacks, still the wage rate will be higher for the blacks. Now, because the labor market matches the black workers with the employers who prefer to hire blacks and matches the white workers, they matches the white workers with the employers who prefer to hire whites. So, now point here is that the blacks may be able to sell their services to those farms, those who are willing to pay for the right to hire them. So, in conclusion, we can say that there are certain interesting implications, and these implications for creation and economic impact of the racial or ethnic enclave economies, means they are surrounded with a group. So, many minorities group they tend to cluster in a small number of geographical areas. So, which will benefit them for a more bargaining power. So, this geographical clustering opens up the sizable opportunity for the minority employer to hire minority workers. So, as a result, we can say this cluster economies may allow blacks and other minorities to escape from the adverse impacts of this discrimination in the labor market if they lie outside the cluster. they can face some kind of adverse impacts if they stay outside of the cluster. If they stay inside the cluster, they may have a positive impact of this discrimination, or they can have more meaningful impact. So, these are the discussions on which we can say that how labor market is, the labor market outcomes are there in terms of profit and employment opportunities it affects, and it is inefficient, and discrimination always pays. Now, how we can measure this discrimination, wage discrimination in the labor market? Measuring wage discrimination in the labor market involves analyzing wage differential between the groups while controlling for the relevant factors such as education, experience, occupation, industry and other characteristics which may affect the earnings. There are several statistical methods. Let's discuss some of them. The first method is the Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition method, which decomposes wage gap between two groups, men and women or white and black. So, the wage gap between two groups into the proportion of attributes to the difference in the observable characteristics and the difference in the unobservable factors like discrimination. We will discuss more detail on this. Further, we can use this regression analysis through which we can estimate this wage discrimination, and we can include the variables like gender, race, ethnicity as the independent variable, and the regression analysis can help in quantifying the extent of wage differential attributes are there in the labor market. Further, we can use the matched employees or employer data. So, analyzing matched employer and employee data set can provide detailed information on the individual workers and their employers, allowing the researcher to control for the farm specific characteristics and explore how wage differential vary across workplace. So, this approach can also helpful in identifying discriminatory practices within a specific companies or in certain specific industries. Further, another method is their propensity score matching. Propensity score matching techniques are used to compare the wages of the individuals with similar observable characteristics, but different group memberships between like men and women. They are in the same characteristics, but they are different groups. So, by matching individual based on their propensity to belong to a particular group, the researchers can estimate the average treatment effects of the group membership on wages while controlling for the compounding variables, some other variables. Field experiment method is also used. So, this provides direct evidence of the discrimination behavior in hiring, wage settings and other aspects. Quantile regression is also used many a times. It is unlikely the ordinary regression model, OLS model, that estimates this average wage differential, and the quantile regression allows the researcher to examine how wage gaps vary across the wage distribution. So, this approach can reveal whether the wage discrimination is more pronounced at the lower or the higher end of the wage scale. So, there are various index measures like gender pay gap ratio, which talks about the ratio of male female earnings. There are other index like Blau-Frewer index, which provides the summary measure of wage differentials between the groups. There are also indexes can be researchers can create certain index on their considering the certain variables which can measure this discrimination in the labor market considering certain constants. So, regardless of the methods used, it is essential to consider the limitation and the potential biases which inherent in each approach. So, all the approaches they are having some limitations. Almost all the methods which we discussed, they have their certain limitations and they have also their certain advantages. Now, let us discuss the Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition method in detail, which is most widely used across the researchers. So, to understand how economists measure discrimination in the labor market, let us take the example that there are only two groups of workers like male and female. So, the average male wage is given by Wm and the average female wage is given by Wf. So, one possible definition of the discrimination is simply get the difference between these mean wages. But if we are going with this simple definition of the difference in the mean wages, this is unappealing because it is comparing, it is a kind of thing, apples and oranges. There are many factors which can contribute to this discrimination, which then generates this discrimination between men and women. So, let us for example, for men, they are more likely to have more professional degrees than women. Then we would not want to claim that the employers discriminate against the women, if the men earns more than women, simply because men are more likely to have the professional degrees. So, a more appropriate definition of labor market discrimination compares the wage of the equally skilled workers. Therefore, we would like to adjust the raw wage differential, which is the difference between the mean wage of male and female. We are trying to adjust for the difference in the skills between these two groups, men and women. So, this adjustment typically conducted by estimating the regression that relates the earnings of the men or women to a wide array of socio-economic and skill characteristics. So, to simplify this, let us say suppose there are only one variables, one is schooling which affects earnings. So, the earning function for each of these two groups, we can write that the male earning function for the male, the wage for the male equals to alpha m is the constant plus beta m s m. Similarly, we can write it for the earning function for female is the Wf is a function equals to alpha f plus beta f Sf. Now, Sf is the schooling, number of year of schooling by male, number of year of schooling by female. So, the regression model implies that the raw wage differential can be rewritten as this, the wage differential between these two groups. It can be rewritten as alpha m plus beta m Sm minus alpha m minus beta f Sf. So, we can now decompose the raw wage differential delta W into a proportion that arises because men and women on an average have different skills, and a proportion of the attributable to the labor market discrimination. So, to conduct this decomposition, we have come to know this Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition. So, it plays a very harmless algebraic trick. So, let us add and subtract the term beta m Sf to the right hand side of the equation, and the various terms in the equation can be rearranged in that form. So, we have subtracted the term beta m into Sf on the right hand side to this equation, and we can rewrite this delta W bar, which is nothing but alpha m minus alpha f plus beta m minus beta f S bar f plus beta m into Sm bar minus Sf bar. So, if there is no skill difference between these men and women, this part is 0, let us assume that both men and women they are having same degree or they are having same number of schooling, year of schooling, then this part becomes 0. So, we can say that there is some kind of discrimination is there in the labor market in their wages because of certain non observable factors like gender. This equation shows that the raw wage differential consists of two parts. One is the skill, the number of year of schooling, average year of schooling. If they are same, then the term SM minus SF is 0. The second part is going to be, there will be no difference. So, the part of the raw wage differential between men and women therefore arises because of the two groups they differ in their skill, if it is not 0. If the first term in the equation will be positive, then either employees they value the man's schooling more than the value of women's schooling. So, beta m is greater than beta f, or this can happen, this the first term in the equation could be positive if the employers just pay more than women for any level of schooling, so that we can interpret the earnings function is higher for the men than the women. So, the wage gap that arises because this differential treatment of men and women is typically defined as discrimination in the labor market. So, this difference in the form of discrimination can be explained through the graph. Now, if we plot this graph of earning functions of men and women, on the x axis we have taken the year of schooling, on the y axis we have taken the wage rate. So, women's earning function is this and the men's earning function is this. Now, if you take into consideration that the gap between this wage rate between this men earnings function and the women earning function. So, with the wage rate with the schooling SF, the female they are going to get the wage rate WF. So, if there is no difference in the wage gap, wage earnings, then the female should have earned W star F amount of wage rate with the same amount of schooling. So, this is the men's earning function. So, this difference is showing that there is some kind of discrimination is there. Further, any difference between these two is also showing some kind of discrimination is there in the labor market. The relationship between earnings and schooling has a higher intercept and steeper slope for men than the women, which means men's they start off with an advantage, they get paid more than women even if the two groups have 0 years of schooling. So, then we can get a bigger payoff for each additional year of schooling. Now, suppose all that men have more schooling than women on average. So, the raw wage differential between men and women is then the difference by the vertical difference WM and WF. So, the average woman with SF years of schooling would earn WF star if she were treated like a man. Therefore, the difference in WF star and WF can be attributed to the discrimination in the labor market. So, the part of the raw differential however also arises because men have more schooling than women. Further, the difference in WM and WF is a part of the differential that is attributed to the skill differential between men and women. Now, to keep this simple, we derive the Oaxaca decomposition as a model where there is only one explanatory variable in the earning function, that is schooling. So, the decomposition can be extended easily to a model where there are many more such variables like age, labor market experience, marital status, regions or country. So, where the workers they live. So, the basic insight is the same. The raw wage differential can be decomposed into a proportion that is due to the difference in the characteristics between two groups, and a proportion that remains unexplained and can be called discrimination. In summary, we can say that the test discrimination affects the employer's hiring decision because the prejudice blinds the employer to the true monetary value associated with the hiring a particular worker. So, an employer who discriminates will act as if the cost of hiring a black or a female worker exceeds the actual cost. Now, if the black and white workers are perfectly substituted in the production process, employers' discrimination leads to the segregation of black and white workers in the labor market and to unequal pay for the equal work. So, the firm's discriminatory behavior also reduces the profit of the firm. So, the impact of discrimination on the wage structure is measured by comparing the wages of the workers who have the same observable skills like educational attainment or the labor market experience, but who also belong to different racial or gender groups. Now, if this comparison does not control for all the dimensions in the skills, this might differ across the workers. So, our measure of discrimination does not isolate the impact of prejudice or statistical discrimination on the wage of the minorities and women. In our next lecture, we will discuss about the labor mobility.